Hi, folks. Welcome to Sustainable Sedition Radio, a podcast that's dedicated to helping you build a life that thrives in changing times through preparedness, homesteading, and the pursuit of liberty. Now, today for episode 12, we're going to be talking about remembering the wisdom of our ancestors. Now, all the skills and all the knowledge that we have in this modern age was built and passed down to us over centuries of trial and error and failure and figuring out what works, figuring out how to be effective out in the world, figuring out how to invent things, how to use tools, how to build skills, how to forge community bonds, right? And today, we're so disconnected from that reality. We have practically instant access to all of our basic needs. We don't need to know how to make rope. We don't need to know how to build a house. We don't need to know how to process an animal. This industrial age, like the Industrial Revolution, right? And now this digital age that we're living in have cut us off from the things that our ancestors all had to do for survival. And I'm not trying to, demonize the industrial age or the digital age at all. I think that there's massive utility in those advancements. Like, for example, we can go on, YouTube University and learn how to process a deer. We can learn how to grow a plant from a seed, right? But at the same time, it's also led us to this almost like a sense of entitlement, to where we just expect everything to be right there on demand all the time. And that's also led to this epidemic of mental illness that we see everywhere because we're disconnected from who we are. We're not out there with our hands in the dirt, getting bloody, getting cut up, running around, getting exercise, growing plants, doing stuff that it's in our DNA to do. So today, we're going to talk about how we can reclaim those lost skills so that we can continue to pass them down and improve our lives. And those skills might just be what keep us alive when the systems that we depend on start to break down. But before we go any further, if you enjoy the show, please take a second, share it with someone that you know or someone who could benefit from the information here. Give us 5 stars and leave a review wherever you're listening. You can follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, wherever you get your podcasts, or you can listen directly at sustainablesedition.com. There, you can sign up for our email list and get weekly updates and be the first in line to hear about upcoming projects in the near future. You can also email me directly at calvin@sustainablesedition.com. That's Calvin spelled Calvin. Again, please, take a second, offer me your feedback, ask me questions that you might have, or give me suggestions for, topics that you want to hear about on the show, because I want to put out what you guys want to hear. Now, with that, let's get into our topic. So, when I'm talking about ancestral wisdom, right, I'm not talking about some, hippy-dippy woo-woo shit. I'm not telling you to go eat a bag of mushrooms and go try and talk into trees. You guys know me. I'm a pragmatist, and I like to come at things from the angle of practical application and how we can remember the things that our ancestors did to not only improve the quality of our life, but also to make sure that those skills don't die. So we're going to talk about getting back in touch with what we've lost. There's a lot of new agey folks who, romanticize our ancestors as like these mystics, right? Who just super wise and, could talk to animals and whatever. And then there's other guys who think that they're just these uncivilized savages. And today we are like this pinnacle of education and advancement. And, both of those have their points. But in reality, our ancestors were just freaking smart. Not all of them. There's always been dumb people. And when I'm talking about our ancestors, I'm talking about all of them, all the way back to like cavemen, right? All the way up to our great-grandparents who found ways to survive the Great Depression and make it through the world wars, right? They were all very different, wherever your lineage comes from, there's so much diversity. There's so many different cultures and strategies that different people used to make their way in the world. But one thing that they all had in common was that they were all self-sufficient and extremely resourceful and industrious because they had to be. They had to figure out how to do what they could with what they had right in front of them. They had to know how to go and hunt elk without being hunted by, a saber-toothed tiger. These guys were bringing down woolly mammoths and getting hunted down by cave bears and shit. They had to invent things. They had to figure out how to tear apart a plant stem, break it down into fibers, and braid it into rope. They had to figure out how to tan hides and make clothing. They had to figure out that if you strike rock A with rock B, depending on the type of rocks you use, you can make a cutting tool or you can create a spark. Now think about just how many centuries and how many generations it took to build up the knowledge that we all have today right at our fingertips, right on our phones. Right? Even just to single out one example just of plants alone. How many people died figuring out which plants were edible and which ones were not. And everything's like that. Everything that we know is the combined knowledge that was built over hundreds of thousands of years by billions of different people. Now, I've tried to break down some of the core foundational stuff that all these guys knew and that they were all practicing into categories that we can talk about one by one today, right? And hopefully we can start to implement them back into our own lives. So for starters, they all had to have some level of basic preparedness. The world is crazy. It always has been. And today we're kept sheltered from a lot of the dangers that our ancestors faced. We're not getting hunted by tigers anymore, but there are still so many things that can and still do go wrong. So having basic preparedness is really just common sense. So in the prepper communities, we have a term called EDC, right? And that stands for everyday carry. So these are the tools that you have on you at all times, every day when you leave your house, even when you're walking around your house. It could be a firearm that you carry. Myself, I always carry my Leatherman, right? It's a little multi-tool with knife and scissors and a file and a bunch of little things. I always carry a knife on my hip. I always carry some way to start fire. And most of us always are carrying a phone around, right? We've got our wallet, and we all have stuff that we always have with us so that we can meet the challenges of the day and be prepared for whatever the day throws at us. Now, next, they all had a certain level of food storage, right? There haven't been refrigerators for the majority of human history. So they had to be creative, and they had to find ways to dry meats, to cure meats, to ferment vegetables. And then later on, we developed technology to be able to pressure can and to preserve food that way. So that's something that is an incredibly important skill for us all to learn. Number one, it's cool, it's fun, and it might be just the thing that helps you and your family make it through the next economic collapse or hard time. Now, the next thing is our ancestors were all expert hunter-gatherers. Not for all of history and not in every place, but the majority of people, that's how we started, in these small hunter-gatherer tribes, right? So they were out there figuring out which mushrooms they could eat, which ones were good for medicine, which ones were good for food, which ones were poisonous that you want to stay away from. They had to figure out how to make herbal remedies, like, drying herbs for teas, how to make salves, how to make poultices, how to make tinctures. They were all experts at going out there and, bringing something with them as part of their everyday carry to bring back any berries or nuts that they found. And these are skills that we can all get out there and start learning. Wherever you're at in your local area, I know that there is some kind of wild edible that you can start adding into your life, whether it's just dandelion roots that are growing in your suburban lot, or whether that's going out there on your neighbor's property and asking them if you can take some blackberries and make some jam, give them a couple jars of jam in exchange. I know for myself, mushroom foraging up here in the Northwest coast is probably one of my favorite things to do. It's an amazing hobby, and it's also something that allows me to have more food security. I go out there and I find chanterelles and lobster mushrooms and lion's mane, oyster mushrooms, and I preserve them. I dry them, I pickle them, I ferment them, I freeze them, and that way I have my favorite seasonal treasures, because that's really what they are, whenever I want, year-round, even when they're out of season. Now, the next most important thing in the hunter-gatherer vein is, you guessed it, hunting. This is one that I'm particularly fired up about because the other night I shot my first feral cow. And if you've been listening to me for a while, you know our situation up here a little bit. We're off-grid. We're way up in the mountains, about an hour away from town, and we have a feral cow problem. At some point, a couple generations ago, some rancher, I don't know if they got lazy, I don't know if the cows just got out or whatever, but the point is, a large amount of cattle got out, and they've been breeding out here for a long time, for a couple generations now. And there are herds with probably 40 to 60 head of cattle just roaming these mountains, destroying people's fences, destroying people's gardens, and they're just a nuisance. They don't belong here. They're not a natural part of this ecosystem. So we have an agreement with the ranchers, and all the neighbors also have this same agreement with them, where it's pretty much kill on sight wherever these cows are. Now, there are a lot of guys up here who just shoot them and leave them. And it's, it sucks, but it's also, none of it goes to waste. There's all kinds of animals that are going to come and be absolutely stoked to find that cow. And at the end of the day, it's a net positive. But us, we're a struggling family, so we try to utilize that resource. So the other night, we got a text message from one of our neighbors that there were a bunch of cows out in her garden, just, eating the leaves off of her fruit trees. So we went out there. I loaded up my Savage Model 99, which is my 1954 Savage Model 99, which is in the line that started in 1895, and it was the first lever action rifle with a rotary magazine, like a revolver, right? And it was the first gun that they were able to utilize the principle of like a revolving pistol and put it into a rifle, and it doesn't have an external magazine that you load. So it's a really cool piece of history. I love using it, and I got my first kill with the thing. So we went out there, lined up the shot. It was a clean headshot, dropped him, and we're like, holy shit, well, now what? So we called some neighbors in, and they helped us butcher out there in the field. We brought it up to the property, let it hang for a couple of days, and then we had a big butchering party last night. We were up till about 1 a.m, just taking this thing apart, and we got over 120 pounds of meat from what we brought back, and we shared that with everyone who came and helped. So, and just being out there, man, hiking around with flashlights, looking for a blood trail, and just being out there with guns and taking that life. It was just such a sacred, beautiful, and primal feeling that I was able to reconnect with. And that's something that I wish for everyone, because it makes you feel so alive, and it fills you with such a sense of capability and of purpose, and fills you with this awe and this reverence for life that, frankly, we're totally disconnected from when we're going to the store and, we're buying a steak and we're buying chicken, and there's, obviously nothing wrong with that. But to be able to connect with where that meat comes from, it just gives you a whole new outlook and a whole new respect, because it's consequence what happens when you take a life. It's sacred. So next, in relation to hunting, there's also fishing. I love fishing. I am by no means like a great fisherman, but I'll tell you what, I'm a pretty decent crabber. So out here on the northwest coast, we're on the ocean, and a few years back, I accidentally pulled a crab pot out of the ocean while I was fishing with my hook. And I had no idea what it was at the time, but I looked it up and figured out how to use it. Bought some chicken, go out there, and I've been coming home with $150 crab dinners for a few years now. It's just one of my favorite things to do. And again, it's that feeling of being capable and being able to go out into nature and bring something back to feed your family. That feeling sticks with you, whether you get that feeling from foraging or from hunting or from fishing, whatever, from raising livestock. Getting in touch with that does something to you on a soul level. And again, I'm not trying to get into any woo-woo shit, but this is what we were built to do. Whether you believe we evolved or we were created, this is what humans do. I also do a lot of sea foraging as well. We'll go and we'll get seaweed, we'll get limpets and mussels and uni, which uni is like the meat inside of a sea urchin. And, we'll just gather them off the rocks. Every once in a while, you come across a huge crab that you can just pick up with your hands. You don't need to go crabbing or nothing. And it's just the coolest feeling ever. Coming home with a buttload of seafood. that would cost you a few $100s if you went out to eat at a restaurant to get. Now next is, these guys were all homesteaders. And they didn't even call it homesteading. It was just what you did, right? Like, of course, you're going to have some kind of a way to grow your own food. You're going to be growing some vegetables at some point, whether that's carrots or corn or whatever. Of course, you're going to have backyard chickens if you have the space and if it makes sense for you. A lot of these guys were shepherds with like large herds. A lot of them were ranchers. And when you start to incorporate animals and plants together in a system, you end up having this closed loop fertility system going on. And that's what permaculture is. Permaculture is just the distilled commonalities and ethics between many different indigenous tribes that lived all over different places in the world. And it takes that knowledge, finds the commonalities, and applies them to modern homesteading and modern technology. So, for example, one of the closed loop systems that we have is we've got this big chicken run, right? The chickens are in there, and there's a compost pit in there. So my kitchen scraps go out into the compost pit. The chickens get to pick through them. The chickens get to scratch it around and turn my compost over for me. I cover it for a day and then open it again when I bring more kitchen scraps out. When I open it up, it's full of bugs. They go in there. They're getting their protein. They're kicking it around. They're composting it for me. They're shitting in it. And then I use that compost to feed my garden, with which I feed my family and create more kitchen scraps for the chickens. It's a great little system. And again, it connects you to these natural cycles that all of our ancestors had a much deeper connection with because they were out there in the elements every day, living it. Now, the next thing is health and physical fitness. We're so unhealthy today. We're just bombarded by artificial dyes and sweeteners and seed oils and processed food and just garbage everywhere. None of that was an option for our ancestors. So they were right off the bat, had a much better chance of being healthy than we do today. And obviously we have had amazing advances in modern medicine, but a lot of that knowledge came from, again, the built up trial and error over centuries. But getting back in touch with how to make your own medicine and heal yourself naturally with what you have. Now that's an incredibly powerful experience. It can be something as simple as making a salve or making a tincture or growing some bee balm and lemon balm to make yourself a nice tea. And again, we got to look at our diets. Yeah, it's hard to navigate through all the, dietitians and all the noise out there. You're going to be a vegan, you're going to be a carnivore, you're going to be keto, you're going to be, paleo, you're going to eat fucking McDonald's every day. It's hard to cut through and figure out what exactly you need to be eating in order to be healthy. But one thing that our ancestors all had in common was that they were not eating this processed shit that we have today. They were eating whole foods, whole ingredients, meat, fish, vegetables, fruits, nuts, legumes, tubers, berries. And if we stick to that ancestral model of eating, we're going to be much better off than the guys who are going and, dropping $100 on a deep freezer full of frozen pizza and chicken pot pies. Now, through most of human history, people weren't out there, lifting weights in order to look physically fit. People were fit because they had to run 20 miles chasing down a freaking antelope and carry it back on their shoulders. They had to train. They had to learn how to defend themselves in their village and their children. They had to be strong enough to draw back a bow and arrow consistently, how to swing tools, how to lift lumber and build structures. And today, with all of our, white-collar career options, we've kind of eliminated that necessity to be out there and to be physically active and to be physically strong. And that's why it's all the more important to take that extra effort to make yourself become strong. Are you physically capable of fending off an attack if somebody tried to, mug you and your wife while you're out? If you're in a house fire and you got to pick your kids up on each of your shoulders and run out of the house, are you going to have a goddamn heart attack when you try to do that? So we need to be putting in that effort to make sure that we are physically capable to deal with challenges and with emergency situations. And that's part of just being a responsible person. But it's also going to give you a level of confidence and make you feel so much better about yourself and your capability to deal with adversity, because a strong body is a strong mind. Now, next, we've got crafting. These guys were all creators. They were working with leather, making clothes and making pouches. They were, again, taking apart plant fibers to weave rope and baskets. They were creating tools out of rocks, creating paints with plant dyes and charcoal, making pottery from clay from a riverbank. Now, obviously, I'm not saying that you have to go and, make everything that you need and make everything that you have with your own two hands. But when you learn how to do it, it again connects you to that deeper human drive to use what we have out in the natural world and create what we need from it. Now, last but not least is the art of creating community bonds. Throughout most of human history, there wasn't, a police officer that you could call if you had, or, a code enforcement officer you could call if you had a dispute with your neighbor. People had to develop means of conflict resolution and find ways to work together and to collaborate, to have a level of mutual aid and value for value exchange. A lot of the time it was based on commerce, because it's a lot more effective to trade or to barter for goods and resources than it is to fight over them. And again, like last night actually, when we got everybody together and we were working together to take apart that cow, man, there is just something so beautiful and almost spiritual about that. Having that sense of working together towards a common goal that's going to benefit everybody involved. That's what humans do. A part of being a good member of a community is being self-sufficient first. You've got to be somebody that can bring something of value to the table. And the more of us that do that, the stronger our communities are going to be. Community is the whole reason that I'm even doing this podcast in the first place, because I'm trying to connect and talk with other people who are like-minded and who want to reconnect with this stuff, who share the same passion for freedom, for nature, and showing up as individuals to benefit humanity as much as each one of us can. And I think now, more than ever, it's important to do that because, we're so divided along every line of difference that we have between, race, gender, whatever. So getting back in touch with this stuff and bonding around this stuff as a community, I think is the antidote to this fractured sense of community that we have today. And it's also the antidote to feeling like shit all the time because we're not doing the things that our ancestors did. We're not doing the things that give us a sense of purpose and a sense of meaning and make us feel alive. Our ancestors were out there hunting with the boys while trying not to get hunted. And dumping beer down our throats and watching war movies is not going to get it done. We need to get out there. We need to get active. And we need to do ancestral shit and reconnect with the wisdom of our ancestors. We need to get back in touch with what we've lost. It's going to improve the quality of your life. It's going to improve your mental health. And it's going to give you the skills that you might need one day. As we watch these systems that we depend on so much for everything continue to decay and collapse. All right, guys. So that's a wrap on episode 12. And man, I love doing these kinds of episodes. This is what Sustainable Sedition is all about. And I really appreciate everyone's patience with me while I'm going through this huge transitional phase with a newborn. I know that the episodes haven't been coming out on Mondays. Sometimes it's been Wednesday. This week it's probably going to be Friday. And things are just kind of all over the place for me right now. But I'm doing the best that I can to make sure that I'm out here every week, showing up for you guys with a new topic, with a new discussion. And I really appreciate your continued engagement and support. Again, it helps me out so much when you guys leave me a rating and when you share this with someone you love and someone who hopefully you can inspire each other to get back in touch with what really matters and to live the way that our ancestors lived. Again, if you want to talk to me directly, my email is calvin@sustainablesedition.com. I want your questions, I want your comments, I want your feedback, and I want to build this community and do it right and make it strong, be able to pass on this stuff and build something that truly thrives in changing times.